Hello and welcome to another Centrify Chalk Talk. My name is Frank Cabri. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Centrify. And today we're going to be talking about authentication and access control, specifically for VMware environments. And I'm joined here today by David McNeely, our Director of Product Management. Welcome, David. So David, a lot of customers are moving toward VMware environments. Clearly that's a strategic initiative for a lot of organizations that we're working with. Maybe you can start by just giving us a background as to some of the authentication issues in a VMware environment and how that works.
Sure. So most of our customers are using VMware in their environments, and they may be virtualizing either active Windows machines or Unix machines. And as you virtualize a machine and you put it into a virtual environment, the one big thing that changes is that the physical server no longer exists. And so as they take this migration, they take a physical machine and they convert it to a virtual, which means now it's a file that lives on a hard drive somewhere. And it gets executed and run in a virtualized environment. The virtualized environment has, based on VMware ESX, does have some ability to let the administrators log in and authenticate to that system and control who can perform administrative functions. So with, and there's a lot of different interfaces used to administer and gain access to the VMware server. So in most cases, ideally, you'd prefer to use your Active Directory credentials in order to log in. And especially for those environments where the administrator is a Windows person that's managing a bunch of Windows machines that got virtualized. But the challenge is that VMware ESX is actually a Unix system underneath based on the Red Hat operating system. And based on that, it has Unix users, and the accounts needed to log in are Unix-based systems. So there's a lot of different interfaces in order to gain access to that virtual machine environment. And we find is, one of the other bigger challenges is going to be as the entire data center gets virtualized, you'll end up with more and more people that, administrators from different departments that need to be able to gain access to the same infrastructure. And the challenge there is how do you manage that over time.
So what are organizations concerned about today in terms of allowing access into the VMware environment? What do they need to be thinking about, and how are they moving forward on controlling that authenticated access to those hosts?
Right. So the first big issue is just like any server, there's the local privileged root accounts or local administrator, and that's really the first one that needs to be locked down in order to control the environments. And ideally, you'd want administrators to log on with their own accounts. Maybe I should draw the environment of the different interfaces that an administrator could use and how that works. So, if the ESX server is the host that hosts all of these virtual machines, a virtual machine is basically cut in half. It has an operating system underneath, and it's typically hosting a single application. The thing is, this gets replicated in numbers of time based on how big is the physical machine underneath the ESX and how scalable that piece of hardware is. So what a lot of people are doing is they're doing this in order to break up the applications so that I can have an individual application completely isolated from the next one. In the old world, we had an operating system and then multiple applications on each of those. So the challenge is that there's a local account here, and it's root, and that account has complete control over managing, in other words, turning on and off each of these VMs, or creating another one, deleting one.
So complete control over the ESX hypervisor as well as the applications and OSs that are running on top.
Right. And all of these guys are all sharing the same common disk underneath, and I can't draw it, but memory or network cards, and compute inside the ESX environment. So the challenge first is getting administrators to log on to this, those people that we want to authorize to do that work, and control how they gain access to manage, turn on and off all of these environments. So ESX has this thing called Virtual Center, and Virtual Center also contains with it a database to keep up with the ESX server, because this might not be your only ESX server. And in fact, most cases, we've got customers that run well over 300 ESX servers. So this, again, is replicated another time for the other ESX server. And so you can tie together all of these back into a virtual center where I can define the accounts in one place. So looking at it from the administrator's desktop point of view, on his desk, there's a number of different ways he could gain access. SSH is the common protocol that I would use to gain access directly to the host itself and log in. And in this case, if I'm logging in directly to the ESX server, it's a service console, and that is done with a Unix account. So I'm actually going to log on.
Via Telnet or some other similar protocol?
Right, the actual protocol in the wire is SSH. And they may use a PuTTY over here as far as a client, or something like WRQ reflections, those kinds of applications. There's also the ability to use the web interface to gain access to the ESX server, because again, this has a web front end to it. You still need to have an account here on the ESX server in order to log in and gain access. So this is why we're saying that it's kind of important that you have the accounts here necessary to be able to log in. There's also another virtual infrastructure client. And this virtual infrastructure client has the ability of logging on and either accessing the virtual center directly, and the virtual center has a management interface back to the ESX, so that when I execute commands here, it goes through the virtual center. I'm actually logging into the virtual center
remotely,
and then from there gaining access to ESX. So in a pure ESX environment, if we add in the Active Directory server here, Virtual Center knows how to authenticate and use Active Directory accounts. And so from that perspective, this authentication can be done with Active Directory.
I see.
The web interface is very similar, tied in through Active Directory. I can either go directly to ESX, or the Virtual Center also has a web interface that we can use to gain access to the Virtual Center. Because Virtual Center lets me see, not only one host, but multiple hosts. And so in large environments, we'll typically find our customers using Virtual Center as a way to manage a lot of their computers. And the typical way of gaining access is going to be directly to the Virtual Center, because it's just easier to manage a whole bunch of computers. The challenge is that if I wanted to use these other interfaces to gain access to the ESX machine, the ESX itself is not natively tied to Active Directory, and at that point, I'm going to have to use a local account. And then the real question there is, which local account? But the thing that we're hearing from a lot of our customers, the reason why there's a need to be able to authenticate directly from my desktop straight to the ESX host is to run some commands like, how much disk space is free here? Or what are the top processes running inside the ESX? I may have one of these virtual machines that's spinning out of control and I can't turn it off. It's harder to get that information from the Virtual Center, because it's more of a machine-specific, machine-centric thing to do.
So is it a more prescribed way, or are we seeing more customers use the client or the web version via Virtual Center versus SSH, or are they using a combination of all three of these methodologies to access the ESX server?
I would say that there's, in talking to our customers, I would say that it's about down the middle. They're using both. They use both the ability to use these interfaces to get to the Virtual Center. In fact, it's actually possible to use the VI client to go straight to the ESX host, but any of these connections directly to a single host still means that you must log in directly to that particular host with an account that the host understands.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons why we start looking at, from a security point of view, we need to protect all of the interfaces that are possible to log into a particular system, and protect all of them.
So does the Virtual Center component integrates with Active Directory? Is there any ESX integration directly with Active Directory as well?
Not natively out of the box.
It's via Virtual Center.
Right, and that's actually what we're providing with Direct Control, is the ability to take this ESX machine and have him join through our Direct Control software, and I'll just draw a little DC there, and tie it into Active Directory. At this point, what we're able to do is then go back and one of the first things we wanted to do is protect this account. So the root account, we can actually map that root account to an Active Directory account over here. Let's call it ESX root. And when people try to log on to this root account, they have to supply this password. And in that case, I can then make sure that there's a password policy being enforced correctly on that account. But one of the other things
and I can also be sure that I know who's making changes and what changes they're making on that platform at that point?
That's the goal, but not quite yet, right? So the next thing is I need to prevent people from logging on as root, and the only way to do that is to make sure that they're logging on with their accounts. So this person that logged onto this desktop, I want to use his Active Directory account and enable him to log on to the ESX. But remember, the commands we want to let him run are commands that require me to log on and run them as root. I'll just pick on ESX top and virtual disk free, VDF. Those two commands require me to execute them as root. If I execute with my own account and I'm not root, they just simply don't give me the data I'm looking for. They only tell me about my processes that are running, not all the processes. So this person that logged on needs to be able to log on as his account and execute with privilege the other command. So we typically use sudo, so that he would typically type in sudo space VDF as an example. And that would then run as root, but he logs on as his account. And we can do that by setting up a sudo policy via direct control, and we use group policy as a way to enforce that. Once we've got this machine tied in, now I can use my AD credentials to log on with all of these interfaces, so that I get much closer to parity now. I've locked down all of the interfaces here, as well as use the same account to log on to Virtual Center as well as the ESX natively. So now these interfaces, I'm going to be using my Active Directory credentials to log on to that ESX server. And at that point, we did lock it down to just the users that we needed to gain access, and also the ability to grant them the privileges that they need to run those commands.
Right. So what's missing? Is there anything else in this environment or with this type of implementation that customers need to be thinking about and concerned about?
Right. So I guess the bigger challenge, there's a couple of different things that they certainly need to think about. One is when you start looking at the various applications, and when you move from your physical environment to this now virtual environment, how generic did you make the virtual environment, and who needs to manage those? If these applications were owned and run by, let's say, finance, and you've got this one run by manufacturing, then you probably had two different IT teams that were managing those two servers.
Right.
And now at this point, I need to be able to somehow segregate the duties and allow the finance people the ability to log on and manage the finance systems, and have manufacturing manage those and keep them completely separate from the two administrators, because I don't want people in manufacturing, the administrators there, to manipulate or turn on and turn off a finance server.
I see.
So we need to be able to have some better granularity and controls within the ESX system. And also at the application, because if these were Linux-based systems, I probably want to control who's logging onto those machines.
Now, how does this differ from anything that's provided within the ESX platform itself? Are these capabilities above and beyond what ESX provides?
Yes, they basically have the ability to, again, they're going to be managing everything out of Virtual Center, and they do have the notion of roles within Virtual Center to grant specific rights. And that works as long as, again, these interfaces are used to connect down to Virtual Center. It only doesn't work when we allow the administrators to log directly onto the ESX machine.
I see.
And as we've spoken to our customers, there's some situations where we need to be able to do that. And so that's why we need to protect the direct access to the ESX host and enable them to perform this work directly. There's another way to look at this, which is, if you start requiring the ability to go back and look at who did something on a particular machine, which is either from an audit perspective, because these are financial systems and I need to protect the credit card data that might be on it, or if it was HR data, you need to protect social security numbers. In that case, we need to audit who's gaining access to the machine. So we can certainly, if this is running Linux or Unix, we can tie them to Active Directory with the direct control product and control who can log on to it. But we also have another product, Direct Audit, that we can use to install on both the ESX host and also the Unix Linux operating systems here to record the activity of those people that log onto the system.
So how does it do that? It records every command an administrator might run on those systems?
Right. So every time you establish a session out to the ESX host, you spawn and create a new terminal shell. And in that environment, we start capturing the data that goes in and out of that shell, so that we see all of the commands that you typed, and we see all the responses that come back to the terminal interface. That gets recorded off onto a database.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of data. How do you manage all that data?
Certainly, it could be a lot of data, but in this environment, since it's mostly text-based, and most of the time we're talking about a few terminal sessions, it's not that many, And so it probably translates to about a megabyte per day for up to, let's say, 10 administrative sessions with about 10 commands each. Certainly you can filter it and you can control how much gets through and recorded into the database. So why don't I show you a graphic here of this concept we were talking about with zones and multiple departments needing to gain access to VMware machines. It might be a little bit easier. I've got some slides here that have a little bit better drawing. My drawing on the board is not going to be the best. But one of the things that we can see here is that I've got two different, or in this case, 5 different virtual machines running ESX. And the thing here is that you've got multiple departments. And so we've actually segregated the different servers. It'd be like taking these two and saying, well, one administrator group is going to gain access to this ESX server, another administrative group is going to gain access to a different ESX server itself. And further, on top of that ESX environment, we may have different departments that have their servers virtualized on top of that ESX infrastructure. It really depends on how IT decides to provide that service back to the organization. We've heard from one of our other customers that they've been doing this, let's say a 5-to-1 trade-in. So you trade in 5 physical servers, they give you 1 virtual machine that can host up to 5 servers and more on top of it. And in that scenario, they're providing the virtual infrastructure service back to the business side of the organization, and running multiple different departments on the same virtual infrastructure. So our zone technology that we offer here allows me to then go back and segregate the administrative duties so that I can have, let's say, finance, development, manufacturing, HR, all these different departments sitting on top of virtual infrastructure and control what they can do to those particular computers.
So does this require some planning in my network architecture? I mean, do I need to consider what my zones need to be? How do companies figure out and rationalize zones with against what they're doing today?
Right, so zones, the design of that is really going to be based on either your administrative boundaries. In this case, I'll show administrative boundaries for the HR zone, where those administrators can gain access to both the virtual machines and also the applications running on top. And also the VMware server zone as a generic infrastructure in order to provide access to the administrators that manage the virtual infrastructure. So it follows both administrative boundary as well as security boundaries for access controls.
I see. Okay.
And a lot of times we'll go back and help customers analyze their environment to figure out what model works best. But the zone model is designed to be flexible enough to provide us the kind of security boundaries that we need, regardless of what the challenges at that particular organization.
Obviously organizations are making moves towards virtualization in an evolutionary way, right? I mean, they've got a heterogeneous environment today of physical servers. They're adding platforms like VMware's ESX to their environment. Does the problem overall become greater? I'm just trying to sum up the challenges that face organizations and how Centrify helps them deal with that transformation of having a dynamic data center from physical to virtual.
Right. So the biggest challenge that most organizations need to think about is that servers and the applications they host used to be physical machines. If I were an attacker, I would need to somehow break into either the application to try to steal the raw data, or if I wanted to steal the server, I would have to physically break into the data center and take the physical machine.
Right.
That's going to be really hard. Physical security, that's been around for a long time. We know exactly how to do that and secure data center doors. And servers, you'd have to steal the whole thing. Grabbing a hard drive, if it were a RAID system, grabbing one's not going to be enough. I need to get the whole thing. And so that's extremely difficult. But if you take that physical infrastructure and then convert it to a completely virtual, where the instance of the server is no longer a physical piece of hardware that I need to physically steal, it's now a file that lives on a file server. That's a whole lot easier electronically to break into a server and gain access to that server and steal that file. That file I can then copy off to my machine or onto a thumb drive.
And walk out the door.
Walk out with it, absolutely. And I just load it up on VMware Fusion or VMware Desktop on my machine and just run it on my laptop. And then I have the exact same server running here that you had in the data center.
Yeah.
it's extreme portability. Now that gave the IT organization a lot of capabilities and a lot of power because they could reduce the amount of physical servers that they needed in order to run the infrastructure. And it gave them a lot of ability to improve the overall service level to the organization. Now that I could take a server that was running and move it from one physical piece of hardware to another one and take this hardware out for maintenance upgrades. So we don't have to worry about upgrades to physical hardware quite as much in the new virtual environment. The challenge is protecting all of that and making sure that there's security in place to protect that new virtual infrastructure. The old physical infrastructure was a rack that was in the data center. It had a KVM switch on it. In order to see the console for these machines, you had to physically be inside the data center. And with this new virtual infrastructure, I don't need to be physically inside that room anymore. Just need network access.
David, very interesting. Thanks for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on authentication and access control for VMware environments. Appreciate it. So again, I'm Frank Cabri alongside David McNeely, and thanks again for joining us for another Centrify Chalk Talk.